I built this house with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, tear by tear. But when I laid the papers on the table proving it was mine, the silence that followed changed everything forever. Subscribe to hear stories that can't be forgotten. I wake up every morning at 5. Not because I have to anymore, but because my body still carries the rhythm of 40 years of hard labor. My fingers, now crooked with arthritis, still remember the weight of cement buckets, the roughness of bricks, the sting of wood splinters digging into my skin. This house where I live today, with its crystal chandeliers and cold marble floors, was once just a patch of dirt that I bought with months of savings from selling baked goods at the farmer's market. I walk through the spacious halls and feel a nostalgia that aches in my chest. The smooth, white-painted walls hide the marks of my fingers, the sweat stains, the tears that fell as I raised each wall alone. My husband worked from sunup to sundown in construction for others, and I made this house my labor of love. I carried stones bigger than my own body, mixed mortar with my bare hands, climbed makeshift scaffolding, praying I wouldn't fall. Today, when my son comes home from work, he barely looks at me. He wears expensive suits, talks on the phone about business I don't understand, and treats this house as if it always existed this way. Perfect, rich, imposing. He's forgotten that he slept the first years of his life on a thin mattress on the floor, while I worked past midnight sewing clothes for others, by the light of a kerosene lamp that made my eyes burn. My daughter-in-law walks through the house like a queen, rearranging furniture, changing curtains, slowly erasing any trace of the simplicity that once inhabited these rooms. She doesn't know that beneath the marble floor in the living room, there's still a penny buried that my little daughter lost, and that I never had the heart to remove, because it was a reminder of times when we were poor, but we were together. The grandchildren grew up here, but to them, I'm just the grandma who lives in the same house, who cooks, who cleans, who exists in silence. They don't know that I planted every tree in the yard, that I dug the well that still works in the back with an old borrowed shovel, that the fruit they eat comes from saplings I brought from the houses where I worked as a housekeeper to save money. Sometimes I pick up an old photo album and spend hours looking. In black and white, there I am, thin, young, smiling even with my face covered in mud. In the photos, the house slowly grows. A wall here, a roof there, a new window. In each picture, my children appear playing among the construction materials, happy, innocent. They were my fuel, my reason to wake before the sun and sleep after the moon. But today, when I look at them, I see strangers, people who live in my house, but who don't see me, who enjoy the comfort I built, but who talk about me as if I'm a burden. I hear whispers. She's getting old. She doesn't understand how things work anymore. It would be better if she went to a home. As if I'm just an unwanted tenant in the house I raised with sacrifice. This morning, while watering the plants on the porch, I felt a different pain in my chest. It wasn't physical. It was the pain of knowing that even surrounded by family, I was completely alone. The house I built to be our eternal shelter had become my silent prison. But deep in my heart, a voice whispered that this story wasn't over yet. It was on a Tuesday morning that everything began to change. I was in the kitchen, making coffee as I always do, when I heard my son talking on the phone in the living room. His tone was formal, calculated, different from the voice I'd known since childhood. I stood still, listening without wanting to be intrusive, but his words reached me like daggers. "Yes, we have all the documentation now," he said. "The house is worth about $3 million on the current market. No, there are no issues with the title. It's all in our name." My hand trembled, spilling hot coffee on the counter. $3 million. The house I built brick by brick was worth $3 million, and he spoke as if I didn't exist, as if my story didn't matter. I tried to approach discreetly, but I stepped on a floorboard that has been creaking since I laid it 30 years ago. He saw me, and immediately hung up the phone. "Good morning, Mom," he said with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was talking about business." I served the coffee in silence, but something had changed. A suspicion began to grow in my chest, like a seed planted in fertile ground. Throughout the day, I watched every family member's movement with different eyes. My daughter-in-law leafed through decorating magazines, making notes. My son received men in suits in the living room, showing them rooms, talking about investments and family estate. In the afternoon, an elegant woman came to visit. They introduced her as a family friend, but I recognized her look. It was the same one buyers gave to houses where I worked as a housekeeper. A look that calculates, that evaluates, that prices every detail. She walked through the rooms as if she were taking inventory, and my son accompanied her, explaining renovations they planned to make. "This area could be modernized," the woman said, pointing to the porch where I usually sunbathe. "And this back part, it has potential. The back where I buried the umbilical cord of each child, where I planted the first vegetable garden, where my husband built a wooden bench where we spent our afternoons. All of this was just potential to her." That night, when the house fell silent, I went down to the kitchen for a drink of water and found my son and daughter-in-law talking in low voices at the dining room table. I hid behind the door and heard fragments of a conversation that chilled my blood. "She won't understand anyway," my daughter-in-law was saying. "Why complicate things?" "I know, but I feel bad," my son replied. "After all, she what? She's lived here all these years without paying anything, without contributing. Now that we can have a better life, she can't be an obstacle. You're right, it's better this way. She'll never know the difference anyway." I returned to my room, my heart pounding. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling that I myself had painted light blue because it was my little daughter's favorite color. Now that ceiling seemed to be caving in on me. They were planning something, and I was the obstacle to be removed. I spent the early morning recalling every sacrifice, every brick carried, every sleepless night working to make this house grow. How dare they talk about me as if I were a burden? How could they forget that it was my arms that raised the walls under which they slept? When the sun rose, I made a decision. She wouldn't be the invisible old lady anymore, accepting everything in silence. It was time to find out exactly what they were plotting, and to fight for the house that was more mine than anyone else's in this world. The war had begun, even if they didn't know it yet. I gathered whatever courage was left in my chest, and the next morning sat down at the breakfast table with a weight I could no longer hide. My son was flipping through the newspaper, feigning nonchalance, but I felt the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. My daughter-in-law was making toast with mechanical movements, avoiding my gaze. "I need to talk to you both," I said, and my voice came out more tremulous than I would have liked. They exchanged a quick glance, and my son folded the newspaper with a sigh he couldn't quite mask. "About what, Mom?" "About this house, about the papers, about the people who've been coming around to appraise everything." The silence that followed was sharp. My daughter-in-law stopped buttering her toast, and my son looked at me as if I'd uncovered a dangerous secret, which in truth I had. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his defensive tone gave him away. "I'm not deaf, son, nor am I blind. I know you're planning something with this house, and I have a right to know what." That's when he said the words that were seared into my soul like a branding iron. "Mom, you need to understand one thing. This house was never yours. My name is on the papers. I pay the bills. I take care of everything. You live here because we allow it, but that doesn't make this house your property." His words fell on me like stones. Never mind. How could he say that? He who nursed at my breast, who grew up watching my skin peel under the sun as I hauled construction materials. How could he forget that this house was born from my sweat, my dream, my sacrifice? "How can you say that?" My voice trembled with indignation. "This house, every brick was paid for with our money," my daughter-in-law interrupted with a coldness I'd never seen before. "I'm sorry, but documents don't lie. Legally, this house has nothing to do with you. I pushed myself up from the chair with such force that it screeched. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. You've forgotten, I said, my voice low but firm, that these hands laid the first stone, that this body carried every bag of cement, that these tears dampened the mortar when you were sick and I had no money for medicine. My son looked away, as if my words bothered him. My daughter-in-law remained impassive. That's the past, Mom, he mumbled. Things are different now. We have responsibilities, obligations. We need to think about the future. And I'm not part of that future. The silence was the most painful answer I could have received. I left the kitchen with the dignity I had left and went up to my room. There, sitting on the edge of the bed where I'd slept for decades, I looked out the windows I'd installed myself. I saw the yard where I'd planted every tree, the laundry area where I'd washed tons of clothes, the little corner where I'd built a small altar to give thanks for every victory. They might have documents, they might have money, they might have legal titles, but there was something they didn't know, something that neither they, nor the lawyers, nor the buyers could imagine. Deep in my closet, inside a yellowed folder my husband kept like a treasure, were papers that could change this whole story. But it wasn't time to show them yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how far they were capable of going. I needed to see with my own eyes how far they had lost their souls. The war had been declared, and they hadn't even suspected I had ammunition. In the following days, I felt like a stranger in my own home. They treated me subtly yet cruelly. They talked about renovations as if I weren't present. They had guests over without telling me. They rearranged furniture without asking my opinion. I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the very rooms I had built. One Thursday morning, I woke up to the sound of unfamiliar voices. I went downstairs and found 3 men in suits walking through the house with clipboards, measuring walls, jotting down details. My son was accompanying them, explaining each room like a tour guide. "This is the master suite," he'd say, opening the door to the bedroom where my husband and I had slept for 20 years. "It has potential for expansion." Potential for expansion. As if my memories were just architectural obstacles to be removed. I approached the group, my heart pounding. "Who are these people?" I asked my son. He looked at me with embarrassment, as if my presence were an inconvenience. "They're consultants, Mom. They're evaluating some possibilities." "What possibilities?" One of the men, younger, looked at me with curiosity. "Are you?" "I'm the owner of this house," I replied before my son could speak. The embarrassment on his face was visible. He swallowed hard and said, "This is my mother. She lives with us. Lives with us." As if she were a boarder, a lodger, a favor they were doing for a needy old woman. The words stung more than a punch. "I see," the man said, making a note. "And would she remain on the property after an eventual transition?" My son and daughter-in-law exchanged a quick glance. "We're still evaluating options," my daughter-in-law replied with a smile that fooled no one. I went upstairs, my legs trembling. Through the window I watched them leave, shaking my son's hand as if they had just closed some kind of deal. My daughter-in-law waved from the porch like a perfect hostess, as if this had been her home for generations. In the afternoon, she started making calls. I passed by the hallways and overheard fragments. "A nice place, with proper care. She's at an age where she needs assistance. It would be best for everyone." A place with proper care. She was talking about nursing homes, about putting me away like a mentally ill person, like someone incapable of taking care of herself. Me, who at 70 still cooked for the whole family, still washed, still cleaned, still tended the garden with my own hands. That night, I pretended to be asleep when I heard the most devastating conversation of all. They were talking in the living room, thinking I wouldn't hear. "The realtor said we could get up to $3.5 million if we do some renovations," my son was saying. "With that money we can buy the apartment in the city we've always wanted, and still have a good amount left over." And your mother? I've already looked into some places. There's a very good nursing home about 40 miles from here. She'll be well cared for. 40 miles? She won't want to go. She won't have a choice. When we sell the house, she'll have nowhere to stay anyway. 25 miles. Far enough so she wouldn't be bothered, so she wouldn't be constantly reminded that this house had a history before them. Far enough so they could rewrite the narrative and become the sole owners of the memory. I bit my pillow to keep from screaming. 40 years of sacrifice, of unconditional love, of giving up my own dreams to fulfill theirs. And it would all end in a nursing home miles away, while they lived comfortably off the money from selling my own house. But they made a mistake I'd discover in the morning when I went down to the basement where my husband kept his most important papers. A mistake that would completely change the game. The truth sometimes sleeps for decades, but when it wakes up, it doesn't forgive. The next morning I went down to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't visited that damp space in years, where my husband kept his tools and his important papers. The smell of mildew mixed with old wood brought back memories that made me pause on the stairs. Him down there, organizing documents on the makeshift table, calling me to sign papers that would be important one day. In the darkest corner behind a stack of spare bricks that were never used was the rusted metal filing cabinet. My hands trembled as I opened the drawers. Inside, envelopes yellowed with time, organized with the meticulous precision my husband always had. Utility bill, taxes, doctor, and there at the back, a different, thicker envelope marked only house. I sat on the cold concrete floor and carefully opened the envelope, like handling a sacred relic. Inside, papers I hadn't seen in decades, the original land purchase agreement from 1982. And there it was, typed on a yellowed sheet, my signature next to my husband's. But what made me gasp wasn't seeing my name. It was seeing that I was the primary owner, that the land had been bought in my name because I had a steady job at the time, while he did odd jobs. I kept flipping through with trembling hands. Building permits, all in my name. Receipts for construction materials paid from my bank account. And then, the document that would change everything. My husband's will, filed with the county 2 years before he died, clearly stating that the house built on the land owned by my wife remains entirely hers, this being my last wish and my way of acknowledging all the sacrifices she made for our family. Tears fell onto the papers, smudging the old ink. He knew. My husband knew that one day I'd need to prove this house was mine. He had protected me even after death, having the recognition that my own children denied me officially recorded. I returned to my room with the envelope hidden against my chest, feeling for the first time in weeks that I wasn't completely helpless. But with the relief came an even greater pain. The clear realization that my own children were capable of deceiving me, of treating me like an intruder in my own home. During lunch, I watched each of them with new eyes. My son, who once cried clinging to my leg during nightmares, was now coldly calculating how to get rid of me. My daughter-in-law, whom I welcomed like a daughter when they married, now saw me as an obstacle to their plans for wealth. "Mom, are you okay?" my son asked, noticing I'd barely touched my food. "I'm great," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "In fact, I've been thinking about a few things." They exchanged suspicious glances. "What things?" "About this house. About our family. About memories that some people seem to have lost." My daughter-in-law cleared her throat uncomfortably. "I don't understand what you mean." I smiled for the first time in weeks. A smile that carried 40 years of wisdom and a few surprises they hadn't anticipated. "Do you remember," I said slowly, savoring each word, "when you were little and I used to tell stories about how this house came to be?" "Mom, that was a long time ago." My son tried to interrupt. "Not so long ago. I remember every detail, every signed document, every paper filed. Some things, once recorded, are never lost." The silence that fell was different from the previous ones. This time I felt I had some control over the situation. It wasn't time to show the documents yet, but it was time for them to know I wouldn't be tricked so easily. "I'm going to rest for a bit," I said, rising from the table. "There are a few things I need to sort out." The war had shifted sides, and they were starting to suspect. It was on a stormy night that I decided the moment had come. Lightning cut the sky like blades of light, and the sound of rain on the roof I'd helped build myself sounded like a symphony of memories. They were gathered in the living room discussing more details about the sale when I came down the stairs carrying the envelope that would change everything. My heart was beating so hard I feared they could hear it. I walked to the cold marble table where they used to hold their meetings about my future and placed the envelope right in the center with a dry thud that cut through their conversation. "What is this?" my son asked, frowning. "The truth," I replied, and my voice sounded firmer than I expected. "Something you seem to have forgotten." My daughter-in-law looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode, which in a way it was. "Mom, we've already discussed this. You're mixing things up," my son began. "I'm not mixing anything up," I interrupted. "Open it." They exchanged hesitant glances. Finally, my son picked up the envelope and carefully withdrew the documents. I saw the exact moment his eyes widened as he read the first paper. The original land purchase agreement from 1982 with my name in bold. This can't be right," my daughter-in-law murmured, craning her neck to read over his shoulder. "Keep reading," I said, sitting down in a chair like a judge observing a courtroom. My son moved to the second document, the building permit, also in my name. The third, receipts for material payments, all from my bank account. And then he reached the last one, which made his face turn completely pale. "Dad's will," he whispered as if reading his own death sentence. "That's right. Your father may be gone, but before he died, he took care to file with the county that this house is mine. Every brick, every shingle, every nail." The silence that followed was deafening. All you could hear was the rain outside and the sound of papers trembling in my son's hands. My daughter-in-law was pale, her mouth hanging open as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. But the papers we have," my son stammered. "The papers you have," I said, rising and walking towards them, "are for partial transfer I made years ago to facilitate bill payments. That doesn't mean transfer of ownership. It means you can use the house, you can manage it, but it's still mine. 42 years I hauled lumber under the scorching sun. 42 years I scraped together every penny for materials. 42 years I turned a patch of dry land into your dream home. That you could send me to a nursing home 50 miles away while you sold my house and kept the money. They were tears of liberation, of a truth that had been suffocated for too long. This house is mine," I said, slamming my palm flat on the table. "And now you know it. The question is, what are we going to do with this information?" My son threw the documents onto the table with a violence I'd never seen in him, and for the first time in decades, I saw pure rage in his eyes. Not sadness, not regret, but fury at being found out. "So that's it," he said, his voice cutting through the air like glass. "You want to humiliate us? You want to make us look like liars, like opportunists? And the right to die in the house I built." "Modest home?" I repeated, feeling my chest tighten. "This modest home that supported you, that sheltered you, that protected you? What rights do you have to the sweat of my brow? To the tears I watered this land with? To the nights I spent awake planning every corner of this house? The difference is, some people know how to manage what they achieve. You can't kick us out," my daughter-in-law said contemptuously. "We've lived here for years. We have possessory rights. Let's see what a judge says about a 70-year-old woman wanting to live alone in a house this size. Let's see what social services thinks of your ability to care for yourself. You'll find a woman who built this house with her own hands and has every document necessary to prove it." My hands were no longer trembling. For the first time in months, I felt in control. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden I had planted. The plants had been watered by the storm and looked more alive, greener, more resilient, just like I felt at that moment. The next morning I woke to the sound of suitcases being dragged down the hall. I went downstairs to find my son and daughter-in-law packing in the living room, my grandchildren watching them with confusion. "Are you guys going on a trip?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. "We're going to stay at my mother's for a few days," my daughter-in-law replied without looking at me, "until we sort this situation out." But the boy looked at me with curiosity, and I saw in those young eyes the same intelligence I recognized in my son as a child, before ambition and greed turned him into the man standing before me. "You can stay," I said, suddenly surprising everyone. "This is the family home. It always has been. This is my home, and here you speak to me with respect. If you can manage that, you can continue living here." I was no longer the submissive matriarch. I was the homeowner making concessions, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own life. It was my oldest grandson who broke the silence that settled over the house in the following days. He found me one afternoon as I was watering the plants in the garden. He sat on the wooden bench his grandfather had built and asked the question I knew was coming. "They're fighting with the truce. How I carried bricks while I was pregnant with his father. How we worked from sunup to sundown to make every wall grow. How every tree in the yard had been planted by my hands." "You built all this?" he asked with genuine admiration. "Your grandfather and I, but mostly me, because he worked outside the home and I was here, overseeing the construction. But they discovered they can't because this house is mine. And it makes sense, because she knows every nook and cranny. She knows where everything comes from." My younger grandson, only 10 years old, who had always been quiet and observant, spoke for the first time in days. "Kids," my son said, in a tone that tried to be paternal but sounded authoritarian, "you don't understand how these things work. It's more complicated than Grandma is making it out to be. You are not going to talk to Grandma about this anymore." It was the silence of a family fragmenting definitively, but also of a new generation discovering its voice. That night, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. It was my oldest grandson who lightly knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I come in, Grandma?" Finally, someone in the family recognized what had always been obvious. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Not in the mouths of adults corrupted by greed, but in the purity of a child who still knew how to distinguish right from wrong. Justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. The final twist came from where I least expected it. One Saturday morning, as I was having coffee alone in the kitchen, my son and daughter-in-law having developed the habit of avoiding meal times, I heard the doorbell ring insistently. When I opened the door, I found an elegant woman about 50 years old, accompanied by a younger man in a suit. "Are you the owner of this residence?" the woman asked with a professional smile. "I am," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. "We're from the law firm Mendes and Associates. We received a request to evaluate the legal situation of this property." "You may come in," I said, deciding to face the situation head-on. We sat in the living room where, weeks before, I had revealed the documents proving my ownership. The lawyer opened a folder and began to speak about issues of civil capacity, elderly welfare, and need for guardianship. "Mom," my son said, "these lawyers are going to help us find the best solution for everyone." "Ma'am, your children have informed us that there are issues with irregular documentation related to the ownership of this house." My 2 grandsons were in the living room, the older one holding a tablet, the younger with a serious expression that didn't suit his 10 years. "Grandma," the older one said, "we recorded something you guys need to see." My daughter-in-law paled. "What did you do?" "We recorded you talking about selling Grandma's house and having her committed against her will," the boy said, hitting play on the tablet. My son's voice echoed in the silent room. "When we sell the house, she won't have a choice anyway. The assisted living facility is 25 miles away, far enough not to bother us." The lawyer's faces changed completely. The elegant woman frowned and looked at my son and daughter-in-law as if seeing them for the first time. "How long ago did you make this recording?" she asked the boys. 3 days ago, my oldest grandson answered. "They didn't know we were listening. The young lawyer took the tablet and listened to a few snippets again. Then he looked at my children with an expression of disapproval he didn't try to hide. "Gentlemen," the lawyer said, putting the papers back in her briefcase, "it appears we were called here under inaccurate information." She stood up and looked at me with a respect she hadn't shown before. "Ma'am, do you have all the documents proving ownership of this house?" I handed over the envelope, and she examined each paper with professional attention. After a few minutes, she looked up and smiled. "Everything is in perfect order. The property is unequivocally yours, and from what I just heard, any attempt to have you committed against your will would constitute misappropriation of assets." My son tried to interrupt, but the investments we made, the investments, the lawyer cut in, were made in a property that did not belong to you, with the owner's consent. That does not create any claim of ownership. She turned back to me. "Ma'am, if at any point you feel pressured or threatened, you can contact us. Cases like this are more common than we imagine, and the law protects elderly homeowners." When the lawyers left, the silence in the room was deafening. My grandsons looked at me as if I were a hero. My son and daughter-in-law seemed to have shrunk physically. "Why did you do that?" my son finally asked, his voice cracking. "Because Grandma didn't deserve to be treated like that," my oldest grandson replied. "And because lying is wrong." In that moment, looking at those brave children who risked their parents' wrath to stand up for what was right, I felt I hadn't just built a house of brick and mortar. I had built a lineage of people who knew right from wrong. The truth had won, but victory had a bitter taste. Because discovering your own children are capable of betraying you is a pain no document can heal. 6 months have passed since that day in the living room. The house is still mine, but it's become a different place. My son and daughter-in-law still live here, but there's now a forced respect, a formal courtesy that hurts more than open hostility. They know they lost the game, and there's no going back. My grandsons, on the other hand, have become my closest companions. The older one helps me with the garden and always asks about the stories of the house's construction. The younger one discovered he likes to cook and spends his afternoons with me in the kitchen, learning recipes I've carried in my memory for decades. Today, as I water the plants that have survived another winter, I reflect on everything that's happened. The house still stands, solid, beautiful, valuable, but its real value was never in the price it could fetch on the market. It was always in the memories it holds, the love invested in every brick, the tears and smiles that seasoned its mortar. Sometimes, when I walk through the silent rooms, I talk to my husband. I thank him for having the wisdom to register that will in the county records that saved me. He knew, even before I did, that one day I would need to prove this house was mine. True love is like that. It protects even after death. My son still occasionally tries to talk to me about the property's future. Always gently, always diplomatically, but I recognize the greed behind the kind words. My daughter-in-law treats me with a cold politeness, greeting me with nods and smiles that don't reach her eyes. But I've discovered I don't need their approval to be happy. At 71, I've learned that chosen solitude is better than false company. I'd rather have my coffee alone, savoring the silence, than pretend we have a close family, when in reality we just have convenient people sharing the same roof. The entire neighborhood learned about the story. Mrs. Maria, who's lived next door for 20 years, told me she always admired my strengths, but now she admired me even more. "You showed your children that a mother isn't a doormat," she said, and her words warmed my heart. I've had visits from other women my age, each with similar stories. Children who became strangers, granddaughters who forgot their grandmother's sacrifices, families that fell apart when money entered the equation. I discovered my pain wasn't unique, but that didn't make it any less. Some afternoons, I sit on the bench my husband built and look at the house we built together. I think about how small and simple it was at the beginning, and how it grew slowly with patience, with love, with dreams deposited in every renovation. The house grew with the family, sheltered joys and sorrows, was a witness to stories that only it and I know completely. If I could go back in time, I would do it all again. I would carry the same bricks, shed the same sweat, invest the same love. Because building isn't just about raising walls. It's about putting down roots. It's about leaving a legacy. It's about proving to the world that you existed and that your existence had purpose. Today, when I watch my grandsons playing in the yard I planted, I see that not all was lost. They've learned a valuable lesson about justice, about courage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Perhaps they will be the ones to keep the true story of this house alive, to tell their children how their great-grandmother built a home with her own hands. The house remains standing, and so do I. Stronger, wiser, more aware of my worth, because I discovered that true inheritance isn't in the papers filed away at the county clerk's office. It's in the dignity we carry, the courage we show, the refusal to accept being erased from our own history. This house is mine. Always has been, always will be. And when I leave this world, I hope it continues to stand as a symbol that mothers, grandmothers, the women who build in silence, should never be forgotten or disrespected. The roots we plant are deeper than any greed, and truth, no matter how they try to bury it, always finds a way to bloom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share, so more people can hear what should never be forgotten. What would you do in this mother's shoes? Comment below and help keep alive the stories that deserve to be remembered.